Only moments ago, the most recent trade ultimatum from Trump began to fail instantly, and it is vital to understand why Canada remains undeterred. Canada is cautioning Washington as its provinces begin to operate as a unified front. Remarkably, Trump views this as strategic advantage, yet the actual result is turmoil for American firms and border state governance. The Premier of Ontario has already indicated that he could impact American residences and industrial facilities through the management of power exports. Millions of consumers are positioned downstream from that metaphorical switch, and this is far from a mere theoretical argument. Trump's associates are suggesting tariffs reaching 35% on Canadian products, with schedules that leave markets and supply networks in a state of high anxiety. The subsequent events will be startling because the intended target is not splintering but rather consolidating, and the resulting repercussions are hitting America before they reach Ottawa. This impact manifests in rising costs, energy instability, and political distress across various states that rely on Canadian resources daily. To comprehend our current situation, one must look back just a few weeks, as this did not occur in isolation but followed a recognizable trend. Over the previous month, Donald Trump has intensified his trade language nearly every day, returning to the same methods used during his initial term involving tariffs, warnings, and demands. He characterizes these actions as displays of power and promotes them under an America First banner, yet specialists caution once more that this approach has failed previously. In private discussions, Trump's consultants are suggesting broad tariff plans directed at Canada, which is the primary trading ally of the United States. This focus is on Canada rather than China or Russia, and the projected figures are startling trade officials. Proposed tariffs range from 25% to 35% on commodities like aluminum, timber, vehicles, and energy-related items, putting entire production chains at risk. For weeks, experts have cautioned about this, with economists highlighting the dangers of retaliation and governors from Michigan, New York, and Minnesota quietly expressing concern. They understand the statistics, noting that Canada represents nearly $900 billion in total annual trade with America. Millions of domestic positions rely on that economic exchange, yet those cautions are being disregarded. Trump maintains that Canada will eventually submit, claiming that individual provinces will break their unity based on an assumption of political division north of the border. That premise is proving to be a significant error in judgment, because while Washington takes a public stance, Ottawa is coordinating its response. More crucially, the provinces are communicating with one another, as Ontario, Quebec, British Columbia, and Alberta, each with unique politics and leaders, have reached a shared conclusion. They have decided that if Washington chooses to escalate, they will provide a unified response. In retrospect, this progression feels unavoidable, as Trump has previously employed similar strategies against the European Union, Mexico, and China. Each instance featured the same assurance of rapid victories and simple compromises, yet each resulted in the same consequences of retaliation, market instability, and domestic price hikes. There is a vital detail that most observers overlook. Canada does not need to replicate tariffs on a dollar-for-dollar basis because it possesses significant influence. Trump is underestimating the importance of energy, electricity, essential minerals, and automotive components that traverse the border many times before a product is finished. Restricting those flows would cause American manufacturers to feel the impact within hours rather than months. This is the very escalation that Trump is inviting, and the situation is now highly volatile. However, the most intriguing aspect is that the response prepared by Canada is not merely symbolic. It is highly focused and aimed at specific vulnerabilities that Trump cannot easily overlook. In the following segment, I will detail exactly what transpired step by step and explain why the mood in Washington shifted from assurance to distress almost overnight. Please remain with me as we analyze the sequence of events, because this is where the prevailing story changes completely. It began early in the morning in Washington when Trump reiterated the threat with even greater specificity. He signaled the immediate imposition of tariffs on Canadian aluminum, timber, vehicles, and energy exports, with internal figures suggesting up to 35% without any exceptions or postponements. Financial markets responded immediately, with futures declining and manufacturing equities showing instability as automotive suppliers were impacted. Within a very short time, companies like Ford, GM, and Stellantis, which depend on parts crossing the border multiple times, saw their values affected. Analysts calculate that a single mid-sized vehicle contains between $8,000 and $10,000 in Canadian-sourced components. Then the initial reaction arrived, as Ottawa did not immediately address the media, which is a significant detail. Instead, the Prime Minister organized an urgent conference call with provincial leaders from Ontario, Quebec, British Columbia, Alberta, Manitoba, and Saskatchewan. Despite having different political agendas, they projected a message of total unity. Within hours, Ontario Premier Doug Ford was the first to speak out quite candidly. He issued a clear warning that Ontario provides electrical power to 1.5 million American residences and firms throughout Michigan, New York, and Minnesota. He stated that Ontario could choose to evaluate those exports rather than terminate them, yet that specific phrasing caused significant alarm. Electricity markets are highly sensitive to uncertainty, and even the suggestion of a disruption causes prices to rise as utilities seek to protect themselves. Analysts project a short-term increase of 7 to 12% in wholesale power costs across the impacted American regions if Canada hints at restrictions. Then an unforeseen development occurred as Quebec followed suit, with Hydro-Quebec confirming it is reviewing its contractual flexibility with American partners. This implies they have the legal capacity to reduce supply in a way that is entirely compliant with existing agreements. Now, the sequence of events is accelerating, as British Columbia suggests it could slow down permits for energy infrastructure heading to the United States. Alberta is considering specific export evaluations for refined energy products, turning this into a conflict between provinces and states. The economic reality supports Canada because it provides electricity, aluminum, potash, timber, and auto parts that American states cannot replace quickly. One cannot create new hydroelectric power in a matter of weeks or reorganize automotive supply chains in a single night. It is impossible to replace Canadian aluminum without increasing expenses by 15 to 20%. Washington then responded as Trump's officials tried to minimize the situation. One high-ranking advisor argued the threats were merely a negotiation strategy, while another insisted Canada would eventually negotiate. However, the general mood changed and their confidence began to fade. Behind the scenes, governors are contacting the White House, with Michigan's leadership expressing deep concern regarding automotive factories. New York utilities are warning about winter energy costs, and Minnesota representatives are calling for official briefings. Then the counter-strategy emerged. Canada has not declared tariffs yet, but instead published a framework for targeted retaliation. This list focuses on specific American goods from politically sensitive swing states, including farm products, industrial tools, and consumer items linked to Trump's supporters. The estimated financial risk is between $40 and $50 billion in American exports. This approach is intentional, as Canada is applying lessons learned from 2018 when their retaliation strategy successfully forced Trump to withdraw steel and aluminum tariffs. This time, Canada is acting more rapidly, with greater intelligence and unity. Markets reacted again by midday, with transportation equities falling, regional utilities declining, and auto suppliers warning of price volatility. One significant manufacturer in the Midwest quietly stopped planning for overtime for the upcoming quarter. Here is the pivotal revelation. Trump expected Canada to fall apart, but they have instead consolidated. The provinces are not in disagreement. They are synchronizing their efforts to present Washington with a coordinated campaign affecting energy, manufacturing, and politics. This is precisely where the strategy fails, because Trump's influence relies on the premise that America can endure hardship for a longer period. However, when that hardship reaches American citizens through power bills, vehicle costs, and employment instability, the logic fails. This is more than just guesswork. Internal trade projections suggest that American buyers will pay for 60 to 70% of the tariff expenses within 6 months. Costs will climb while salaries stagnate, and political support will likely decline. The following developments are surprising even to experienced political figures, as Republican representatives from border states are beginning to break away quietly. They are not making public appearances but are contacting Treasury and Commerce departments to request special treatment. Canada is aware of this shift. This situation is not about national pride but about applying precise pressure. However, there is a factor that hasn't been fully disclosed yet. This conflict is far from over. The next phase moves beyond trade levies into the realm of legal action, shifting from economic turmoil to international and constitutional consequences. In the next segment, we will consult experts including legal academics, economists, and George Conway. By examining the legal errors here, you will understand why this plan is likely to collapse rather than succeed. Please stay with me as the analysis becomes more rigorous and the strategy begins to fail under close examination. Legal specialists are already signaling concerns because Trump is threatening tariffs based on questionable legal standing. He is relying on emergency trade authorities meant for national security crises rather than political bargaining. This is where George Conway provides insight, noting that the Constitution assigns the regulation of foreign trade to Congress rather than the President. While emergency laws do exist, the legal system requires genuine emergencies rather than manufactured scenarios or campaign rhetoric. Conway describes this strategy as legally fragile and warns that imposing broad tariffs on Canada, a close ally, will lead to judicial intervention. The current administration's position might not hold up, and the legal precedent is significant. In previous instances, the courts have only supported executive trade measures when there is a clear threat to national security. Canada does not fit that description, as there is no aggressive intent or strategic blockade involved. Economists also note that tariffs of 25 to 35% on Canadian goods would function as a disguised tax on American buyers. Various models suggest that American households could face yearly cost increases of $1,200 to $1,800 per family. This is a matter of simple math, and George Will even points to historical examples like the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930. That era shared the same overconfidence and the mistaken belief that protectionist policies create useful leverage. Instead, it sparked retaliatory actions and worsened economic distress. The international legal perspective is equally problematic, as the USMCA, the very agreement Trump updated, contains specific dispute resolution systems. Trump's warnings could lead to immediate and public arbitration processes. Legal academics point out that applying tariffs unilaterally without valid reasons breaches both USMCA and World Trade Organization guidelines. This makes Washington vulnerable to joint challenges from Canada, as well as Europe and Asia, who are observing closely. There is a more profound point many are missing. This is a test of our institutions. Trump's strategy assumes that courts will be slow, allies will be hesitant, and markets will be patient. However, this time the response is faster, with judges showing doubt and markets adjusting for risk immediately, while allies coordinate in private. That increased speed alters the entire situation, and immediate consequences are approaching. Within days, we might see legal stays requested by American importers, with preliminary decisions coming in weeks. Every subsequent step creates the kind of uncertainty that financial markets find intolerable. Conway also argues that this move represents vulnerability rather than power. By reaching too far, Trump risks a legal loss that would damage his political image of being in total control. The irony is that a strategy meant to show dominance instead highlights a lack of it, and leverage disappears once that is revealed. However, the legal battle is just one aspect of the problem, as the actual economic effects are already moving through communities. In the upcoming section, we will follow these effects from manufacturing plants to household finances and from state governments to global centers. Once you see the scale of this impact, you will see why this moment is so significant. Please stay with me as we discuss the consequences, because this moves beyond simple paperwork. This affects real individuals very quickly, starting with the economy. Within hours of the warning, commodity markets shifted. Aluminum prices rose by 9%, and timber futures increased by 11%. Costs for automotive materials rose almost instantly, and manufacturers generally pass those costs to consumers. This results in higher vehicle prices, with analysts predicting increases of $2,500 to $3,000 per car if the tariffs remain. For families already dealing with high costs, this is a heavy burden. In Michigan and Ohio, auto workers are the first to feel this, as factories depend on rapid delivery from Ontario. Even small delays at the border lead to reduced shifts and potential furloughs. Labor leaders are quietly warning of significant job losses if this uncertainty continues. Farmers are also at risk, as Canada plans to target American agriculture, including soybeans and dairy products. States like Wisconsin, Iowa, and Pennsylvania could suffer, much like in 2018, when similar actions cost farmers over $27 billion. This time, Canada's strategy is even more precise, and the electricity factor adds more difficulty. Power supplied by Ontario and Quebec to border states will likely see price increases, with New York and Minnesota households potentially seeing 5 to 10% higher bills. Winter conditions will only make this more difficult. Governors in swing states are becoming anxious as they deal with voters who are unhappy about rising costs. Politicians are calling for exemptions, and public support is beginning to waver. Furthermore, there is a social impact on small businesses that often goes unmentioned. Local repair shops and construction companies with small profit margins cannot protect themselves as easily as large corporations, leading to hiring freezes or closures. Globally, the damage is spreading as Europe considers aligning with Canada and Mexico expresses its own worries. Asian partners are also questioning American consistency, making this a broader issue of international credibility. The immediate effects are seen in days, with short-term impacts following in weeks and long-term consequences lasting years. Supply chains will change, investments will move, and trust will be damaged. The irony is that while Canada will adjust, American consumers will be the ones paying the price. There may be some winners among domestic producers, but higher costs for materials will likely cancel out those gains. Most will lose in this scenario, and once the process starts, it is very hard to stop. However, those who support the policy argue that the difficulty is a necessary part of a larger strategy. Let's examine their perspective in the next section. We will look at the official story and then compare it to the current situation, as the inconsistencies are becoming hard to ignore. Supporters of Trump argue that this is a brilliant plan, claiming that tariffs will force Canada to give in. High-ranking campaign figures suggest this pressure will recover jobs and fix trade imbalances. They argue the hardship is only temporary and that America can outlast its neighbor, suggesting that critics are simply overreacting. However, the actual situation is quite different. First, the idea that Canada will simply give up is not supported by the facts. Canada is not in the same economic position as Mexico in this context, and has significant influence through energy and minerals. Unlike other partners, Canada is acting with national and provincial coordination. Second, the idea that the pain is temporary does not match historical evidence from 2018, where prices rose and stayed high long after the political event ended. This creates lasting structural harm rather than a temporary strategic advantage. They also claim tariffs help American workers, but this is contradictory. If previous tariffs were successful, why did the government need to provide $28 billion in farm aid? Why did growth in manufacturing slow down and exporters lose permanent market share? Supporters believe the courts will stay out of it, but legal experts like George Conway suggest that overreaching will lead to judicial corrections. Once the legal system intervenes, the idea of total executive control disappears. There is also the national security claim regarding Canadian imports, which is hard to believe. Canada is a NATO member and a key defense partner. Labeling their aluminum a threat while using their energy is inconsistent. Critics suggest this is more about public performance than actual policy, and they have a point. If the goal were truly leverage, the administration would be negotiating quietly rather than making public threats that force retaliation. Instead, the situation is escalated in public while being managed poorly in private. You might wonder why they continue. It's because retreating now would look like a sign of weakness. This is a situation where political image is prioritized over economic common sense. While officials claim everything is fine, the data shows that markets are shaky and businesses are hesitant to act. This is not a stable situation but one of denial, which only speeds up the negative results. This leads to the most critical question: what happens from here? The path ahead is no longer just a theory. It is taking shape now with very high stakes. In the upcoming section, we will look at 3 possible scenarios: the best case, the most likely, and the worst case. Once these are explained, you will see why the next few days are so important. All attention is now on the next steps, as every action will have real effects. Let's start with the most positive outcome, where more rational voices take control behind the scenes. In this version, pressure from state leaders and business groups leads to a pause in the plan. The administration would quietly delay the tariffs, and Canada would likewise freeze its retaliation, moving the conflict to the USMCA panels. This would prevent immediate economic harm and stabilize the markets. However, this requires Trump to back away without publicly admitting it, which is historically quite rare. Now, let's look at the most probable scenario, which is quite complicated. Here, Trump implements a limited version of the tariffs, and Canada responds with targeted retaliation against specific American exports. Energy reviews would remain a possibility, and legal fights would start immediately. Importers would file lawsuits, and courts would issue preliminary rulings as uncertainty continues. Markets wouldn't crash, but wouldn't improve either, as hiring and investment would slow down while prices rose. This would lead to months of ongoing damage without a clear resolution. Finally, there is the worst-case scenario that experts are worried about. Trump expands the tariffs, and Canada responds by tightening electricity exports, causing prices to jump in the Midwest and Northeast. Winter would make the situation even worse, as Canada coordinates with other global allies. The European Union and Mexico might shift their cooperation, and multiple trade fights would happen at once. Courts might eventually step in, but not before significant damage is done to the auto industry and employment. Inflation would rise quickly, and voters would react, leading to a loss of political support. The primary driver across all these outcomes is ego. If choices are made based on image rather than facts, the escalation will continue. Experts believe the next month or two will be vital. Every court filing and market reaction will signal the direction we are heading. If there is restraint, the damage might be limited. If there is defiance, the consequences will be much worse. It's important to understand that trade conflicts aren't resolved through speeches, but through economic reality and job statistics. Currently, the math does not support further escalation, which brings us to why this matters to you. This is about your own costs and your financial future, and the coming days will determine the price you pay. To conclude, what we are seeing is a test of judgment, where political talk is meeting the hard truth of reality. When policy ignores economic facts and legal standards, the results are swift. Prices go up, jobs become less secure, and stability is lost. The people who suffer first are the citizens paying for power, vehicles, and groceries. This moment is important because it shows that power without limits is a risk, and leadership without responsibility leads to trouble. Trade conflicts do not reward boldness, they punish errors. Now, I'm interested in your opinion on what will happen next. Do you think things will get worse, or will calmer voices prevail? Are you noticing any of these effects in your own life yet? Please share your thoughts in the comments section. If you found this analysis useful, please like the video and subscribe for more detailed reports. Be sure to turn on notifications so you stay updated on this story. We will keep a close eye on the markets and the legal filings because this situation is still developing. The next few days will be very important, so please stay informed.